Hello and welcome. My guest today is an active politician and a prolific writer and commentator. His 12th book that was released recently seeks to take the discussion on India's foreign policy into the drawing room. He makes the case in this book called Pax Indica for a multi-aligned India in a multipolar world. He was the UN Under-Secretary General for Communications and Public Information. He was also former Minister of State for External Affairs, and he is currently the Member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, it's good to have you back on this show.
Good to be with you again, Anurag.
And tell us, Dr. Tharoor, why do you feel that the layman needs to know and engage with foreign policy? Why is it important?
Because it affects the daily life of Indians. You know, people think of foreign policy as something for diplomats in pinstripe suits in foreign embassies. The truth is, actually, things that happen elsewhere in the world affect Indians on a daily basis. Whether you are a person working for a call center connected to foreign clients or for a multinational corporation, or whether you are a fisherwoman in Thiruvananthapuram who's worried about the price of kerosene for the boat, or worried about being shot at by foreign trawlers in your waters or whatever, you have foreign policy impinging upon people in all walks of life and at all levels of our society. So we can't afford to be indifferent to foreign policy, and in this increasingly globalized world, young Indians are growing up into an India which simply cannot be disconnected from the rest of the world.
Ever since 1991 and the economic liberalization process started, economics and the Indian economic story became a very large part of India's image and the Indian story globally. It has also impacted foreign policy. How much did the Ministry of External Affairs have to change to accommodate this role that economics started playing?
Oh, it's changed significantly, Anuradha. When I first became aware of the ministry in the late 70s, when I was doing my doctoral thesis on Indian foreign policy, I can tell you that most Indian ambassadors would sneer at having to have anything to do with business relations, trade relations, and so on. They saw themselves as being essentially involved in geopolitics. The cables they wrote about, sensitive conversations on impending political aspects of the relationship with the country they were credited to, that was what mattered to them. Today, every Indian ambassador is conscious and is made to feel conscious that he is also a salesman for brand India. That an ambassador abroad has to facilitate foreigners coming and investing in India, foreigners trading with India, Indian companies trying to trade with those countries. This is very much an indispensable part now of our work. And I would say the percentage of time that an Indian ambassador or any official in his embassy spends on economic and trade issues has increased exponentially in each of the last 3 decades.
And yet the Commerce Ministry leads a lot of the international, foreign policy, for lack of a better word, on trade, isn't it?
Correct, but the Commerce Ministry usually, in almost every case, doesn't have any representative of its own in these embassies. So the Commerce Ministry leads, if you like, the policy level discussions, the trade negotiations, but the implementation on a daily basis, on a day-to-day basis, has to be by the Foreign Service officers from the MEA who are posted in these embassies. So there has to be a synergy. In some countries, the Foreign Trade Ministry and the Foreign Ministry are one and the same. They merge together. In our case, they're different. But the synergy has to be very intense.
The fact that India's economic story seems to be waning, how much of a challenge is that going to be on foreign policy, which uses this economics and our economic interests as a big part of our foreign policy?
See, Anuradha, it is a challenge, but that's what diplomats are there for. They should rise to the challenge. My argument is that it's precisely when we have so much of negativism out there about the Indian economy that our diplomats are really earning their salary, going out and telling the alternative story, saying that in fact this is a misrepresentation, that this exaggerated pessimism about India is not well founded. Frankly, the exaggerated optimism about India was also overblown at one time. But the truth has always been somewhere in between. And right now there are a number of positive factors in India that justify that 5.9% growth, which is still the second largest of the major economies after China. Nobody else is growing faster than us. And we should be able to say that we have enough positives that investors should keep coming, that traders should still keep coming.
So that's the communications part of it. But if the India economic story slows down, will it affect the way foreign policy has been conducted in the last 20 years?
It will affect the way we are perceived. You know, there was a time as recently as a year or two ago when practically every head of state and government in the world was beating a path to our door. Our protocol people were ridiculously overstretched by the sheer volume of people, a number of people who wanting to come and have visits to India, meet the Prime Minister and the President and so on. And we simply could not cope. We actually had a waiting list of heads of state and government whom we could not invite because there was so long a list and our capacity to cope with so many of them was reduced. Now, obviously, many of those were coming because India was the next big thing, the success story, etc. And if that image is tarnished, fewer of them will necessarily want to come, because in those days they needed to be seen by their own domestic publics as engaging with this successful, thriving India. That aspect will be less relevant to them today.
Let's talk about Pakistan. Your book, not surprisingly, begins with the chapter on Indo-Pakistan relations. And
well, after the introductory chapter.
Yeah, you know what I mean. Substantively, I think that's where the meat begins.
Sure.
And it's not surprising, given what the kind of mind space that the Indo-Pakistan relationship occupies. Now here, since I'm not an expert, I'm going to quote from what a former Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal said or critiqued about your book in the India Today, and I'm quoting him. He says, while he does analyze with perspicacity the wellsprings of Pakistan's endemic hostility towards India, he also endorses liberally the facile arguments in favor of engaging that country. Curiously, he scoffs at track 2 diplomacy with Pakistan, but resorts to the same hope-inspired verbiage to advocate an approach of, in quotes, accomodativeness, sensitivity, and pragmatic generosity.
Yeah, but in fact,
seems to suggest that on the Indo-Pakistan issue, at best, you're unrealistic, and at worst, you're a romantic.
Completely false. In fact, that's a willful misreading, it seems to me, of the thrust of my argument, because I am not certainly a hawk in the sense that I don't believe there is a military solution to the conflict, but I'm certainly far from being one of these candle-lighted Wagah peaceniks and doves. I'm a dove who's been mugged by reality. So I've pointed out in the book that Vajpayee's bus yatra was rewarded by Kargil, and Manmohan Ji's work with Musharraf and later Zardari was followed by 2611. So we have to be profoundly disillusioned by Pakistan's own track record vis-a-vis us. And I don't go in with any illusions, any naivety at all. I make a realist argument for peace with Pakistan. And the realist argument is, first, we can't afford indefinite hostility with Pakistan because we are the country that is focused on our domestic growth and development, and we don't want it to be distracted by conflict or the impending threat of conflict, which means investors will be driven away. No investor wants to come to a war zone. Traders will not want to come and risk their money in a country that could be in conflict. Essentially, we would find hostility with Pakistan being an albatross around our neck. So in our self-interest, we need peace with Pakistan. I also argue that I'm giving very specific concrete suggestions. Trade, for example. I argue that if we actually open up our markets to the Pakistanis, right now, if the ISI or the Lashkar-e-Toiba or Jamaat-ud-Dawa, any of these organizations conduct a hostile act against India, they pay no domestic price because no one is affected. Pakistan has no stake in India. Whereas if tomorrow a large element of the Pakistani establishment, the capitalist community, the business community, are making money in India, have client relationships, markets, consumers in India, they are actually going to become a constituency for peace because they will tell the extremists in their own country that your actions are hurting us.
But Dr. Tharoor, it's easier said than done, isn't it? And it always gets stuck on, 2611 and bringing that to conclusion, getting verdicts out over there, isn't it? Because, Kanwal Sibal goes on to say that he, in this case, you, believe that India has an effective option of dragging Pakistan to the UN to force compliance with Security Council resolutions on terrorism if bilateral dialogue fails, with an exclamation. Again, suggesting that, you cannot get to all your suggestions unless you have hard solutions on this front.
Yeah, but what hard solution are you thinking about? Can we go and bomb them? Can we attack them? Can we mass tanks on the border? We've tried all of that and nothing has worked, right? We are facing a country which has significant elements in it that want to coexist with us, but which has equally powerful, perhaps more powerful elements in that establishment who thrive on hostility with India and whose own dominance of Pakistani society requires hostility with India. Now we need to isolate them, narrow the space they have by opening up the space for those in Pakistan who wish to deal with us peacefully, want to coexist, want to cooperate.
What do you make of the attention that President Zardari's visit to Ajmer Sharif and en route stopping by to meet Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh? What do you make of this and the kind of attention it gets? Does it contribute to evolving foreign policy,
yes,
or is it just a big
No, I think
stunt?
it was a very sincere signal from Pakistanis, at least the Zardari side of the Pakistani establishment, that they really want to talk to us. And it was a friendly thing. His son came with him and tweeted the whole day about his meetings and so on. I thought it was a very nice example of a very public kind of diplomacy that sought to send signals far larger than any substantive conversation. In fact, my understanding is there was no real substantive progress made, but the symbolic value and the signals being sent are important. In diplomacy, these things matter.
And they contribute to what will follow then as foreign policy?
Well, as you know, it's been followed by talks amongst the Home Secretaries, talks amongst the Foreign Secretaries. There is a looming conversation in early September between the Foreign Ministers. It seems to me that there is a process now ongoing of talking to each other, which certainly has followed this gesture by President Zardari. And our own gesture, by the way, of facilitating his trip and inviting him to Delhi.
Yes. Dr. Tharoor, let's talk about the Arab Spring, because that sort of series or chain of events in these West Asian countries and North African countries has been one of the biggest global developments in the past year or 2 years. Do you think India has lost an opportunity here to take a leadership position, when it comes to showing the way to people looking to become democracies and looking to overthrow authoritarian rules and regimes?
Well, that is a very tough call for India to make, because first of all, yes, the West moved very fast forward on Libya, on Egypt, on Syria, essentially calling for changes of regimes and so on. Whereas in India, we have not only had good relationships with some of these countries,
yes, and
Syria,
their leaders.
Egypt in particular, and their leaders, but we also have had, in the case of Libya and Egypt, Indian populations that might have been under threat. In Libya, over 100,000 Indians had to be evacuated, and we felt that taking an active stand could have hurt them literally as well as financially and in terms of their life there. With Syria, look at our dilemma. You have a government which may actually have done everything that the West accuses it of doing against its own people, but it's a secular Arab state that has been sympathetic to us on most issues involving the Islamic world, including Kashmir, where we have very few countries in the Islamic world, in the Arab world, that are willing to be sympathetic to our point of view. So naturally, the prospect of losing a secular friend and seeing it replaced by a potentially jihadist element gives us pause. Now, obviously, it's a very difficult dilemma. You want the people of any country to be able to determine their own political destiny, choose their own leaders. We do that in India. Why shouldn't the Syrians have that right? So,
and why shouldn't we help? Because, Dr. Tharoor, even as we speak, I think on August 4th, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution which said, amongst other things, that there was grave concern at the escalating violence in Syria, and that they would like the country to lock down its chemical and biological weapons. Because it seems this resolution was based on, had calls for President Assad to step down, India abstained. India abstained last year in the United Nations Security Council on that vote to attack Libya. Is this helping us in the long run? Because aren't we being seen as, and I'm the layman, so aren't we being seen as a country that's not taking a stand? And tomorrow, when these regimes are overthrown, those people and those elected governments will remember.
Possibly, though again, you must understand international relations.
It's not as simple as I'm making out to be.
It's not like human relations in that there is very little space for either gratitude or resentment over a long period of time. I mean, after all, we liberated Bangladesh and the gratitude didn't last very long. Similarly, we may fail to be on the right side of history, to use that famous expression from the last few months, and yet history has a way of catching up, because the new government will have to deal with India and we will have to deal with them whenever there is a new government. In the case of Libya, to be honest, I think the Indian vote was the right one, because we have a long-standing allergy to the idea that an outside power or powers can change a government by the use of force and bombing. That is something that really troubles us, because having fought for our own independence for 200 years, how would we like it if another country were to try and impose their will by military action against us? So we wouldn't want anybody else to undergo that either. On Syria, I am afraid I've been so busy with the book in the last couple of days, I haven't read our so-called explanation of vote. If I were to guess why we abstained, it would probably be, and I'm simply guessing, that the resolution must have prejudged the outcome, made the stepping down of Assad a precondition, rather than it being the outcome of a negotiated settlement. Because India would probably say we want the two sides to talk to each other and come up with an agreed formula, as part of which the Assad regime could go or be joined by others, or Assad could move or whatever, could resign. But I think it must have been, I'm just guessing here, that the resolution prejudged an outcome.
But you think in the long run that people won't remember in these countries that India abstained? We're not even taking a stand. In 1947, India did not recognize Israel, isn't it?
Well, we actually voted against the creation of it.
We voted against the creation. Exactly. It didn't recognize, isn't it? So that's what I'm saying.
No, well, once the state was created, we did recognize it, and the fact that we voted against did not stop the Israelis from really making an effort to cultivate the relationship, which culminated in the upgrading to ambassador level in 1991. So yes, things take time, but with history you have to take a much larger span.
Soft power, which is something that you've made a case for over a period of time now, isn't it? Where India's
about
concerned.
a decade I've been going on about it.
So, do you think that the government of India and the Ministry of External Affairs takes soft power and its impact seriously enough? And by that I mean not paying lip service to it, but put in money and investments behind this.
Well, it's gradually happening. I must say that I think I may have helped stir a level of attention and interest. Now I see words like soft power being used in the Prime Minister's speeches, the Foreign Minister's speeches. That's, to me, a great sign that they've woken up to the importance of this already in the last few years. We are also spending more resources on soft power than we used to before, more cultural centers, a public diplomacy program which is being well staffed and well put out. There's still a lot more we can do to leverage this. You know, a lot of our soft power comes despite the government and not because of the government.
It's the trickle-down effect of our culture, isn't it?
Exactly.
Which sort of lands up as movies or food or whatever.
The popularity of Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi in Afghanistan, the government could have done nothing about it. But that popularity has been a huge asset for India with the Afghan people, and so on. But still, I think the government could do a little more systematic thinking about how to leverage these assets we have into positive press and positive feelings about us.
Because in your book, you mentioned the fact that China, since 2004, has set up this Confucius Institutes, as strategy, and
hundreds of them,
and invests in ensuring that people are learning Mandarin. And I think in your book, you've quoted 100 million people learning Mandarin. Is there a lesson there for the Indian government? Should it go after soft power, pretty much like the Chinese are doing now, or the Americans did earlier? Or even the Russians during the Cold War.
The Americans certainly did the VOA and the Fulbright scholarships and so on, and at the same time that was outstripped by the things the American government has nothing to do with, from Disney World to Kodak to McDonald's and Starbucks and all of that, and Coca-Cola and jeans. So America too is a country where the government input is much less than ours. But from our point of view, yes, I do think we should do much more of this systematically. We may not have the resources available to replicate hundreds of Nehru centers the way they have hundreds of Confucius institutes, but we certainly need to do more and do it more systematically in a more targeted and thoughtful way than perhaps we have done so far.
And yet you also say that soft power becomes credible when there is hard power behind it.
I absolutely feel that. If soft power comes along with us being a soft state, then the respect you gain from your soft power will be undercut by the lack of respect for a soft state. You've got to be credible.
And you've used the 1962 war with China, or the defeat to China as...
The defeat with China, the shameful surrender of the hijackers in '99. There have been a few really disgraceful episodes where we have really given the impression that we don't have any credible military capacity. Those days, I hope, will be firmly behind us. Certainly, we should be spending the money it takes to modernize our defense. We should be building up defense infrastructure, and we should be so credible with our weaponry, our equipment, our ships and tanks and planes, that nobody feels that they can tamper with India or fool around with us. We have an unresolved border dispute with China. We should never convey the signal that we are so weak that it would be no effort for them to march in and take over whatever they want. Hard power without soft power is actually resented.
Yeah.
But soft power without hard power is an admission of weakness.
Would you say that China has both now, given the kind of investments it's making in Africa, and what we've already talked about, and is garnering both?
China, I must say, in many ways has been effective in trying to create a soft power image for itself, but it's seriously undermined by the globe's perception of China as a pretty ruthless dictatorship, one that cracks down on the Tibetans, cracks down on the Uyghurs, cracks down on any dissent, cracks down on Nobel Prize winning human rights people. So I don't think China at the moment is doing half as well as us, because its own record speaks against its efforts to create a soft power image.
Final question. I mean, there are lots of things we could touch upon, but alas, the show doesn't allow for it. So no Africa, no newly accessible Myanmar, none of that. But that'll be another conversation. But the final question: should the ordinary Indian believe and aspire to India being a superpower?
No, I don't think you can be a superpower when you're still super poor. I think we're moving to a world beyond superpowers anyway. The Americans are not going to be the kind of dominant superpower they are now in 20, 30 years. They will always be a very major power. And you might even continue using the word superpower, but the capacity they had even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, to exercise their will anywhere in the world, that is no longer going to be possible. China may aspire to a similar status, but I believe it will fall short of, say, where the US was in 1995. India will not even get to that level, but will be a very significant player on the world stage and very powerful in the regional stage, and so on. I believe we're going to have a multipolar world. There are going to be a number of poles, and none of them is truly going to be a world-dominating country. Pax Indica is about India actually managing a peace system for itself, which works in harmony with other countries in a networked world.
Dr. Tharoor, it was lovely talking to you, and I can't resist one final question actually, and which is, I know it's not up to you, but any news of heading back to the MEA?
As you said, it's not up to me. If asked, I'm available. If not asked, I've got plenty to do.
Oh, as usual, it's a pleasure talking to you. All the best.
Thank you.